Thanks, Eileen. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight to celebrate the outdoors and to celebrate life. I'd just like to dedicate my talk tonight to my brother in the mountains, Brent Seal. Rumi said, "What in your life is calling you? When all the noise is silenced, the meeting's adjourned, the lists laid aside, and the wild iris blooms by itself in the dark forest, what still pulls on your soul?" In other words, what is your dream? Not the one that you're thinking about up here, but the one that you're feeling deep inside, when all else is quiet and calm and still. It's a question that Brent and I used to talk about often in the mountains. This is a carving he gave me some time ago. And one thing I always admired about Brent in all the years that I knew him is that he never gave up on his dream. Back in 2012, I had a dream of climbing a pyramidal peak deep in the Himalaya of northern Nepal that I'd only identified in a photograph. And the peak was in this valley that had been closed off to outsiders for generations. Prior to that, you weren't allowed to go in there as an outsider. I will say that I did not climb the mountain. I was caught in a snowstorm at 17,000 feet, and the mule that was carrying my climbing gear ran away. But one thing we did find was this little cave high up in the cliffside one day with the remnants of a wall in front of it. And I was so frustrated that I couldn't fulfill my dream of climbing this mountain that one day I just threw my backpack to the ground and I started climbing up the cliff face with my two Sherpa companions. And it was kind of terrifying because the rock was all crumbling and loose, and some of the rocks were coming out at our touch. But eventually we got up to the opening of the cave, and I remember feeling the cool air from deep within that abyss just against my face. And so we flicked on our head torches, and in we went. And as we worked our way up the narrow passage, it kept getting tighter and tighter until some of the openings were so small we had to just literally jam our bodies through them. But eventually we came to the back of the cave, and it opened into this small cavern. When I shone my headlamp to the ground, I saw all these human bones, hundreds of bones, perhaps thousands of bones, skulls and vertebrae and femurs, ribs. And I realized this wasn't just a cave. This was a tomb. Here's young Umang playing with some of the bones. When I got home, I was looking at some of the video, and I realized he could actually fit his face entirely in that jawbone. Which is kind of curious. But the whole scene was kind of eerie, so we left the cave, we went back down to the settlement, and all the locals we spoke with didn't know anything about any bones in the cave. Not even this 70-year-old woman, the oldest woman we could find in the village, knew anything about it. When we came back to Canada, one of the first things I saw at the airport was this National Geographic magazine. It said, "Secrets of the Sky Tombs" by Mark Aldendorfer. Now, Mark Aldendorfer is this National Geographic explorer. He's also an anthropologist. And he had been doing research about these sky caves, or these sky tombs, as he called them, several valleys over from where we were. So we sent Mark the coordinates of our cave. And about a year and a half later, he went back there with his team. And what he found were 23 individuals, ranging from children to teenagers to adults, some artifacts, a bunch of animals that had been sacrificed with the bodies. And he dated the remains back to over 2,300 years ago, over 2,300 years ago. But perhaps the most interesting thing he found were these little firebrands that were placed around the bones that were used to ward off evil spirits. And Mark believes that at that time, an epidemic had hit the people there and had wiped out a good part of their tribe. And of course, at that time, they didn't know what a virus was, but they believed that it was these evil spirits, they actually called them these death vampires, that came down and sucked the vitality out of their people. And so they took the bodies, they buried them deep into this cave, they put these firebrands around them to ward off the spirits, and then they barricaded the entire thing, sealing it off with this wall. Until 2,300 years later, my two Sherpa companions and I stumbled in there. And I couldn't help but thinking, how all these questions were running through my mind, like, who were these people? Why were they coming through that part of the Himalaya at that time? What was their story? And had the cave been sanctified as some sort of a doorway from which they could pass from the end of one life and into the next? Now, the Tibetans have a word for that kind of a place, that kind of a doorway. They call it the bardo, which translates as place of transition, a transitionary state between death and rebirth, between who we were and who we become. Now we know that the Tibetans believe in reincarnation from lifetime to lifetime, but they also believe that we can incarnate many times in one lifetime, since we're always changing, never stagnant. We weren't the same person we were when we were born, nor are we the same person we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or maybe even last week. And the bardo is that place where we can choose, what of my past do I want to let go of, that no longer serves me, that I can just let be? And what of me do I want to carry forward into who I become? What tethers us to the past or the future is what we choose to keep inside of us. Do not get lost in the bardo, the Tibetans will say. Do not get lost in the bardo. In other words, do not try to move forward in one aspect of your life when you're trying to grasp onto something behind you. It can create this sense of feeling lost or stuck in your life or in your mind. According to renowned spinal surgeon Dr. Hansaw, 90% of people feeling some sort of chronic pain are still angry at the person or the situation that hurt them in the first place. But the person that they are most angry with is actually themselves. What tethers us to the past or the future is what we choose to keep inside us. And Brent knew this. I saw Brent evolve again and again and again through challenge after relapse after challenge, using his illness not as some sort of a crutch or some sort of a life sentence, but as a springboard from which he could create new life. Embrace the suffering, he would say. Embrace the suffering because that helps us overcome future sufferings. Over the years, Brent and I, we climbed many mountains together. Fortunately, we have many mountains in our own backyard. Some of our favorites, Mount Garibaldi, the Tantalus Range, the south side of Tantalus, Mount Dione, north side of Tantalus. But perhaps one of the most memorable times we ever went out was not on some big epic climb or some big epic day, It was on this day. A little winter hike up to Red Heather Cabin. And for those of you who know Red Heather Cabin, you know to get there, you got to go up all these switchbacks, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, until you finally get to the little cabin. That day I was on my skis, and Brent was on his snowshoes, which is kind of ironic because Brent's actually a much better skier than I am. But I was on my skis that day, he wore snowshoes, and we had this beautiful conversation all the way up all those switchbacks until we finally got to Red Heather Cabin. And on the way down, I would ski a little bit and then wait for Brent. Brent would catch up on his snowshoes. Then I'd ski a little bit more and wait, and then Brent would catch up with his snowshoes. And I thought, there's got to be a better way to do this. Now, of all the times Brent and I had ever gone out over all the years, not once did he ever bring a crazy carpet. Except for that day. I thought, okay, we have a crazy carpet. Do we have any rope? And sure enough, I don't know why, but that day Brent brought a bit of short rope. And so we were able to tie ourselves together. And I pointed my skis down, and off we went. And we picked up speed quite quickly, because it was particularly icy. And I remember just flying down the switchbacks so fast that I'd come whipping around one of the banks, and Brent would come whipping around with me, and he'd nearly go flying into the woods off the crazy carpet. But then the rope would catch him at the last second and yank him down the next switchback. And we were laughing our heads off. We were laughing so hard. We were laughing like children. And people coming up the trail, they could hear us before they could see us. I'd see this guy coming skiing down, just laughing his head off like a child. Like, what is going on? I'd come whipping past them. And then right behind me would be Brent on this crazy carpet, laughing his head off. He'd come, they'd almost have to jump out of the way. And I just, I just realized years later that it was never about climbing mountains. It was just about being out there with my friend. And so to honor these precious memories, these precious moments of joy, let's do a meditation together. If you'd like to just sit comfortably where you are, just rest your feet on the ground if that's comfortable. You can rest your arms beside you. And take a couple breaths in together. Let's take a deep breath in and then out. Take another deep breath in and then out. Just relax your shoulders. Relax your neck and your forehead. Just be deeply relaxed where you are, deeply relaxed. You can close your eyes if you like, or rest them gently in front of you. Imagine you're walking along a gentle mountain path. See the expanse of nature in front of you. Hear the sounds. Feel the sun, the warmth of it, the richness of the air. take it all in. And as you're walking along that mountain path, imagine that there's a bend in the path. And as you come around the bend, you arrive at a vision, a memory, perhaps, a time that brought you deep joy. Maybe you're with someone. Maybe you're by yourself. Or if not a memory, something that brings you and fulfills you with deep joy. Whatever it is, just be there with that moment. Be there in that moment. Feel the joy flowing through you like water. And as you're feeling that emotion of joy, is there a message that's coming to you? Perhaps from the person you're with, or maybe from yourself. What is that message that you're receiving? What is that message that you're receiving? Moments of joy can be fleeting. They can arrive to us in a heartbeat, and they can leave us just as fast. But if we let them, they can stay with us for an eternity. I once heard a story about a golden Buddha. Many years ago, there was this golden Buddha in a monastery. And the monks there, they heard that there were people coming to take the Buddha, take what they had. They didn't want that to happen. So they covered the whole Buddha with mud. They covered the whole thing with mud until all it looked like was this clump of mud in the corner. And it stayed like that for days, and days became weeks, and months, and years became decades. Until everyone forgot that there was a golden Buddha there. They just thought it was a clump of mud. Until one day, a young monk was picking at the mud, and a piece broke off. And from underneath, this golden light shone through. I feel like life is like that. We have these moments when this radiating golden light just seems to shine through us. Whether it's confidently walking through one of the bardos of life, or whether we fully and completely embrace these simple moments of joy. The question becomes, what do we do in those moments? Do we cover the light back up as though it never existed? As though it was part of our imagination? Maybe out of anger or fear or some sort of expectation from others or society? Or do we practice with courage to remove more and more of that mud? Stephen Pressfield says, Our job in this lifetime is not to shape ourselves into some ideal we imagine we ought to be. It is to realize who we already are and then become it. Realize who you already are and become it. A few months ago, Chantal and I, we were climbing up to Mount Mathieu. And for those of you who know Mount Mathieu, Mount Joffre, you'll know that a few years ago, part of Mount Joffre came down. A big part of the mountain calved off, came ripping down through the valley, changed the entire makeup of the valley, just put the trees aside, swept them aside like sticks. It's quite amazing, quite a phenomenal thing if you get a chance to go up there and see it, how nature can just change everything in a heartbeat. And as Chantal and I, we were making our way up through that debris, we just looked at each other and commented on how still things felt that day. Almost like nature had somehow reclaimed itself. And all of a sudden, there in front of us was this moose, just looking at us. And we were all just looking at each other, just calm and gentle. And we stood there for a couple minutes, and then eventually the moose kind of just slowly walked into the forest. And I remember the feeling that came over me was this sense of total completeness. Completeness within myself, completeness with each other, with Chantal, and completeness with everything else around me. And so I'd like to just leave you with a poem that I wrote that was inspired by Brent. Stillness. Stillness. It is the beginning and the end of all things. Like the pool of water returned to its natural state, or the tiny droplet taking rest on a delicate leaf. It is the eye of the deer, a dark and endless orb as deep as the universe, filled with 1 billion stars. It is the great owl, extending from branch and trunk, seeing from behind its yellow eyes, hearing what cannot be heard. Heavenly clouds basking before the golden sun, the great snowy mountain still as stone, rays of morning light dipping through the treetops. It speaks the language of the earth, a language that has been shaped and carved and created over 100 million years. It is the language of the heart. It is where our souls come alive. It is where we call home. And so, as long as I draw breath, I will do my best to move toward that stillness, to be that stillness. For that is where I find myself, and that is where we find each other again. Thank you. Tashidele.
Thank you so much, Mike.